The wind howled across the Colorado ridgeline, flinging snow sideways against the weathered sign of the North Star Lodge. 10:47 at night, and Garrett Sullivan stood alone behind the counter, sleeves rolled to his elbows, despite the chill seeping through every crack in the old timber walls. A single lamp cast long shadows across the empty room, throwing his silhouette against the knotted pine like a sentinel refusing to abandon post. He pulled a small cash box from beneath the bar and tipped its contents onto the scarred oak surface. Bills fluttered like exhausted birds, 2 20s, a 10-3, crumpled ones, and a scatter of coins. He counted twice, though the result wouldn't change. $63. The meager sum seemed to mock him in the dim light, a punchline to a joke that had stopped being funny 18 months ago. Next to the cash sat a white envelope bearing the bank's insignia in cold blue print. Garrett unfolded the notice again, though he'd memorized every word 3 days prior when it arrived. Final notice of foreclosure. Amount due $18,000. Deadline 10 days. 10 days until a stranger with a clipboard would come to lock the doors of North Star Lodge, the business he'd built from his Marine savings, and sweat the promise he'd made to Grace before cancer took her 3 years back. From the hallway came soft, even breathing. Sophie slept curled under the quilt her mother had sewn, the one patterned with tiny stars that had faded with each washing. Garrett pictured her tumble of chestnut curls against the pillow, and for a moment the tightness in his chest loosened. She couldn't know, not tonight. Maybe not ever, if he could find a miracle somewhere in the next 240 hours. He set the envelope aside and reached for a rag to polish the bar top, though it was already clean. The motion calmed him, slow circles over scarred oak, the smell of lemon oil mingling with wood smoke from the fireplace. The North Star had been his gamble after coming home from his second tour, a place for travelers and hunters, built on the promise that even in these mountains people needed somewhere to gather when the world felt too large and indifferent. For a while, summer tourists and autumn hunting parties had kept it alive. But winters were merciless here, and COVID had scared off the final wave of guests in 2020. Then came Grace's diagnosis in 2019, the treatments that drained their savings faster than he could replenish them, the slow, terrible march toward a funeral he still couldn't believe had actually happened. Medical bills had piled up like snowdrifts against the door, each one another shovel of dirt on the grave of his dream. The blizzard outside growled louder, rattling windows in their frames. Garrett checked his watch, the same Luminox he'd worn in Kandahar and Al Anbar province. 11:16. Too late for customers, too early for surrender. His phone buzzed on the counter screen, glowing with a text from a number he'd grown to despise over the past year. Last chance, Garrett. Sign the deed, walk away with $50,000. Midnight deadline tomorrow. Don't be stupid. Richard Coleman, Madison Developers. The vulture who'd been circling his property for months, eager to acquire the strategic mountainside location for their luxury resort plans. Garrett's jaw tightened as he powered off the phone without responding. He'd sooner burn the North Star to the ground than sell to those parasites who saw his failure as their opportunity, who measured human struggle in square footage and profit margins. The radio on the shelf crackled with the automated emergency broadcast. Severe blizzard warning for Boulder and Larimer counties. Category 5 conditions. -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill approaching -50. Travel not advised. Roads impassable. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Garrett stepped to the front window, pushing aside the heavy curtain. Nothing but white chaos met his gaze. The mountain road beyond had vanished under snowdrifts 3 feet deep and climbing. No one would drive up here tonight. Anyone caught outside in this storm wouldn't last an hour before hypothermia shut down their core temperature and left them frozen in whatever position death found them. He thought of Grace, how she would have handled this moment. She'd always been the optimist, the one who believed problems were just puzzles waiting for the right combination of persistence and grace. He could almost hear her voice now, soft and certain, even when the cancer had reduced her to a shadow of herself. Don't let grief make you cold, Garrett. Sophie needs warmth, not just shelter. But warmth required fuel, and fuel required money he didn't have. The propane tank outside was down to fumes. The woodpile would last maybe 3 more days if he rationed carefully. After that, nothing but the cold and the collectors and the inevitable march toward losing everything. The sudden sound froze him in place. At first he thought it was the wind shifting ice off the roof, but the rhythm was wrong. A deep mechanical rumble cutting through the storm's howl, multiple engines in perfect unison. Motorcycles. In a blizzard. At 11:47 at night. Beyond the swirling snow, faint amber glows pulsed low and steady. His mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Nobody rode in conditions like this unless they had a death wish or no choice. The glow sharpened into beams of light cutting through the whiteout. 1, 2, 5, 10. At least 20 headlamps formed a constellation of moving stars, each haloed by snow. Garrett's pulse quickened. His first instinct was pure Marine training, the kind drilled into him during 2 tours in hostile territory. Assess, secure, adapt. He checked the shotgun under the bar, not to use, just to know it was there. Sophie's breathing remained steady in the back room. He'd keep it that way no matter what waited outside. Through the frosted glass, silhouettes emerged. Riders dismounting their machines, thick jackets, dusted white helmets tucked under arms. At their center, a figure strode forward with unmistakable authority. Long black coat whipping in the gale, silver rings flashing on gloved hands, even at a distance the confident lift of her chin visible through the storm's fury. The door handle rattled. Then a woman's voice, steady and commanding, cut through the howl. "We need shelter. 20 of us." Roads closed behind. Garrett exhaled slowly, breath clouding in the cold air. 20 strangers. 20 variables. On a night when the world had already taken everything but his last $63 and his sleeping daughter, a choice waited on the threshold. Fear or trust. Retreat or the stubborn kind of hospitality that had once defined the North Star before debt and death had stripped it down to bare survival. The blizzard didn't wait for his decision. It surged through the doorway as soon as Garrett turned the lock, a fist of icy air that clawed across the room. The lantern above the entrance swung violently on its chain, casting erratic bands of amber light over the snow-choked parking lot. Beyond, 20 motorcycles stood like iron sentinels, their headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the storm. Engines throbbed in a low, unified rhythm that Garrett felt in his chest, reminiscent of distant artillery fire. This wasn't a random group of thrill-seekers. This was an organized convoy, disciplined and purposeful. A tall woman with commanding posture unbuckled her helmet and shook free a mane of dark hair streaked with premature silver. Her sharp gray eyes, almost silver in the flickering light, locked onto him with the intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating threats in milliseconds. "I'm Tori Blackwood, Silver Wings. We just rode from Utah. Roads behind us are sealed with ice. We need shelter, warmth, food, anything." The name stirred a faint recollection. Silver Wings, a renowned all-female motorcycle collective that raised funds for women's shelters and veterans' causes. He'd read about them in some magazine Grace had left lying around years back when the future still seemed full of possibilities instead of foreclosure notices. Behind Tori, the rest of the riders dismounted and practiced silence. Their boots crunched over ice-black leather vests marked with silver insignias, a winged helmet, and the words, "Ride free, stand strong." Garrett's mind worked through military training protocols. Assess, secure, adapt. 20 strangers meant limited supplies stretched dangerously thin. 2 days of canned goods at best, a dwindling bag of coffee, and Sophie sleeping soundly in the back, unaware that her father was about to gamble their last resources on people he didn't know. But something steadied within him. Perhaps the discipline drilled into his bones during boot camp at Paris Island, or the memory of fellow Marines offering rations to desperate villagers in Iraqi desert towns. Maybe it was the way Tori's plea cut through the storm with urgency, but without panic, the voice of someone who'd led others through worse and refused to let fear dictate decisions. "Come in, kill the engines. Carbon monoxide's no friend tonight." A ripple of relief passed through the group. Tori turned, issuing quick, decisive hand signals that reminded Garrett of infantry squad leaders coordinating fire teams. One by one, the bikers wheeled their machines under the eaves, covering them with tarps and tying knots with practiced efficiency despite numbed fingers. Then, like a migrating flock, they filed toward the entrance. The moment they crossed the threshold, the North Star transformed. Warmth and the scent of pine sap greeted them, but so did an almost sacred hush. Snowflakes melted instantly on leather jackets, dotting the wooden floor with silver specks. Garrett bolted the door against the gale, sealing them all inside together. "Hang your gear near the stove, boots on the mat. Keep the floor dry if you can." Tori's glance swept the room with professional assessment. The scarred oak bar, the dim neon beer signs from another decade, the solitary Christmas wreath Sophie had hung on a window pane back in December, still there in late January because neither of them had the heart to take it down. Nice place. Has character. It was once. The words came out more honest than Garrett had intended, carrying 3 years of accumulated grief and 18 months of corporate pressure from Madison developers. The bikers fanned out, shaking off snow and stamping warmth into their toes. Their vests bore embroidered names Diana, Lexi, Sarah, each one telling a story Garrett couldn't yet read. Some women looked barely 30. Others carried the seasoned calm of riders who'd seen 1,000 highways and refused to be impressed by any of them. Tattoos traced their arms and necks like topographical maps of lives he knew nothing about. A Celtic knot on one woman's wrist, a phoenix rising on another's shoulder, memorial dates inked in Roman numerals. These weren't weekend hobbyists. These were women who'd chosen the road as a way of life, who carried their histories on their skin and their loyalty in their bones. Sophie's soft footsteps startled him. She appeared in the hallway doorway, quilt draped around her shoulders like a cape, eyes wide at the sight of so many strangers filling the room her father usually kept empty. Garrett crouched beside her, one hand gentle on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart. These ladies got caught in the storm. They just need a safe place tonight." A silver-haired biker with kind eyes and a Celtic knot tattoo on her wrist knelt to Sophie's height, moving slowly so as not to frighten the child. "Hi there, little one. I'm Diana. We don't bite, promise." Sophie's nervous glance shifted to her father. At his nod, she gave a small wave, and the tension in the room softened just enough for Garrett to notice shoulders relaxing, faces losing some of their storm-beaten hardness. Tori removed her gloves and extended a firm, calloused hand that spoke of years gripping motorcycle controls through every kind of weather. "Thank you. We'll pay for every crumb we eat, every drop we drink. Name your price." Garrett shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip and a faint scar along her knuckles that looked like it came from something harder than falling off a bike. "Price is stay warm, stay respectful. We'll figure the rest later." A murmur of appreciation passed among the riders, low voices thanking whatever gods watched over travelers for leading them to someone who still remembered what hospitality meant in a world increasingly divided between those who had and those who took. "I've got chili fixings, some beans, bread, coffee, though it's rationed. Beans and bread sound like a feast." The voice came from somewhere in the back, earning a round of appreciative chuckles that brightened the room further. Within minutes, the North Star transformed from a deserted outpost into a bustling refuge. Jackets hung heavy on hooks, boots steamed near the stove, the air filling with the metallic scent of thawing leather and the earthy aroma of chili simmering on the old iron range. Garrett moved through the kitchen with military efficiency, stretching 2 cans of beans and a pound of ground beef into something that might feed 22 people if nobody asked for seconds. He added onions, the last of his tomato paste spices Grace had bought years ago, that still packed enough punch to make the thin broth taste like more than desperation cooked down to its essence. Tori settled at a corner table, eyes never fully leaving Garrett as he worked. She spoke in low tones to Diana, who nodded toward the bank envelope Garrett had left on the counter without realizing it. He quickly tucked it under the ledger, but Tori had already noticed. Her expression didn't change, but something in the way she held herself suggested she'd read volumes in that single glimpse of white paper and blue ink. "You running this place alone?" "Mostly. My daughter helps when she can. That's a lot on one man." Garrett met her gaze for a long beat, the storm outside hammering the walls like it wanted to break through and scatter them all back into the frozen darkness. "Had more help once. Things change." He didn't elaborate. Didn't mention Grace or the medical bills, or the way grief had turned him into someone who measured days by how well he kept Sophie fed and warm rather than by any larger ambition. Tori seemed to understand the weight of what he wasn't saying the way veterans often recognized each other's silences as clearly as civilians heard words. As the night deepened, snow battered the windows in relentless sheets. Yet inside, warmth thickened like a second skin against the cold. Laughter sparked here and there as the bikers swapped road stories. Lexi, a young woman with brilliant blue eyes and restless energy, described a ride through Arizona where they'd outrun a dust storm for 30 miles. Sarah Mitchell, whose weathered hand suggested years of hard work, told about the time their convoy helped rebuild a veteran's barn after a tornado flattened it. Sophie, now fully awake and curious, perched on a stool watching Garrett ladle chili into bowls. Every so often she whispered questions about tattoos or bikes, which the women answered with patience and smiles that suggested many of them had daughters or nieces or younger sisters they missed while on the road. Garrett felt an odd sensation of fragile peace, as though the storm had pushed an unexpected family onto his doorstep. He moved among the tables with quiet efficiency, refilling mugs from the coffee pot he'd stretched with an extra cup of water to make it last, adding logs to the fire that Diana tended with the practiced care of someone who understood how precious heat became when you couldn't simply turn up a thermostat. Each action, simple and necessary, felt like a small stand against despair. The foreclosure notice still sat under the ledger. Coleman's midnight deadline still ticked down with each passing second. But for this moment, with 20 strangers eating his last food and warming themselves by his dying fire, Garrett felt something he hadn't experienced since Grace's funeral, the possibility that he wasn't completely alone in the fight. Near midnight, when the last bowls were scraped clean and the wood stove glowed like a captured sun, Tori caught his eye again. There was curiosity there, the same professional assessment she'd given the room when she first entered, but now it carried something else, a glint he recognized from long-ago patrols in hostile territory. Respect for a fellow soldier, even if she didn't yet know the details of his service. You move like military. Marines was. Long time ago. Tori's expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through the CEO armor she wore like Kevlar. My father was Marines. Didn't make it back from his second tour. Garrett paused in wiping down the countercloth going still in his hands. I'm sorry for your loss. It was 20 years ago, but you never really stop missing them, do you? No, you don't. The admission cost him something to speak aloud, acknowledging that Grace's absence still carved holes in every day, despite 3 years of practice at pretending otherwise. Sophie had settled against Diana's shoulder, drowsy in the warmth, her small face peaceful in a way that made Garrett's chest ache with protective love. Tori stood moving to help Diana arrange blankets near the stove, where several riders had already claimed sleeping spots. The oldest among them took positions closest to the heat, the youngest forming an outer ring like a defensive perimeter. Garrett noticed the pattern, the way they organized themselves without discussion, each woman knowing her place in the hierarchy through years of riding together. He should sleep, should try to rest while Sophie was safe and warm. But his mind wouldn't settle, kept cycling through the same calculations. $63, $18,000 owed, 10 days, 20 mouths to feed tomorrow, 1.5 days of supplies if he stretched them to breaking. The generator in the back room coughed, sputtered, then steadied. Garrett made a mental note to check the fuel level at first light. If it failed in this cold, they'd all freeze before the plows could clear the roads. Assuming the plows even tried to reach this far up the mountain in a Category 5 blizzard. Tori approached him at the bar where he stood organizing what little inventory remained. Can I ask you something? Garrett nodded, exhausted but too wired for sleep. Why did you let us in? You don't know us. We could be anyone. He considered the question. Thought about lying or deflecting, then decided honesty cost nothing when you were already bankrupt. Marine Code. You don't leave people in the desert to die. Doesn't matter if it's Kandahar or Colorado. Tori's eyes widened fractionally, surprise breaking through her controlled expression. You served in Afghanistan and Iraq. 2 tours total. Got out in 2011 when my wife got sick. The timeline hung between them, dates that meant nothing to civilians, but carried weight for anyone who'd worn the uniform during those years. Tori pulled a set of dog tags from beneath her shirt, metal glinting in the low light. Captain David Blackwood, K.I.A., December 2005, Al Anbar Province. Garrett's blood went cold. He knew that name, knew it the way he knew the scars on his own body and the nightmares that still woke him some nights drenched in sweat. Captain Blackwood was your father? Tori nodded, tears suddenly bright in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. Did you know him? Garrett set down the inventory clipboard, every muscle in his body going rigid with the memory of December 18, 2005. The day Echo Company walked into an ambush. The day Captain David Blackwood took a sniper round meant for Garrett's recon team and bled out before the medevac could arrive. I was there. I was there when he died. The words came out barely above a whisper, but in the quiet room they carried like thunder. Every biker still awake turned to look. Sophie stirred against Diana's shoulder but didn't wake. Tori's hand went to her mouth, muffling a sound that could have been grief or shock or something larger than both. Garrett moved to the fireplace, hands shaking as he added another log he couldn't afford to burn. The motion gave him something to do with the adrenaline suddenly flooding his system, the old familiar readiness for combat that never fully left, no matter how many years passed or how deeply he tried to bury it. When he turned back, Tori had crossed the room to stand directly in front of him. She reached for the collar of his flannel shirt, fingers gentle but insistent as she unbuttoned the top closure. Garrett should have pulled away, should have maintained the distance he'd carefully constructed between himself and everyone since Grace died. But something in Tori's eyes stopped him, a need to know that transcended normal boundaries of privacy. The fabric fell open, revealing the tattoo that covered his left chest. Eagle globe and anchor rendered in bold black ink, the iconic emblem of the United States Marine Corps. Above it the words Semper Fidelis, arched in serif script that Grace had helped him choose during better days. Below, the outline of a combat ribbon that represented more pain and pride than he knew how to articulate. The room went absolutely silent. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as though the world itself held its breath. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on Garrett's chest, where his service was literally written on his skin, undeniable proof that he was exactly what Tori had suspected from the moment she watched him move with that distinctive economy of motion that marked men trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Tori's fingers traced the eagle, not touching his skin, but hovering just above it with a reverence that made Garrett's throat tight. He saved your life. It wasn't a question. Garrett nodded, unable to speak past the grief that rose up after 20 years of trying to outrun it. December 18th. We were clearing a market sector in Ramadi. Intel said it was secure. It wasn't. Your father saw the sniper in the window. He pushed me down, took the round himself. Tori's hand dropped to her side, tears streaming freely now, though her posture remained straight, shoulders back, in a military bearing she'd probably learned from the father she'd lost when she was 15 years old. I was told he died protecting his men. They didn't say who. Because I didn't tell anyone. Because I couldn't face the fact that a good man with a daughter and a wife died so a nobody Lance Corporal from Colorado could live another day. You weren't a nobody to him. Marines don't die for nobodies. They die for brothers. The word landed like a punch to Garrett's sternum. Brothers. It was the truth. He'd spent 2 decades trying to forget the bond forged in blood and sacrifice that made civilian life feel hollow by comparison. He'd tried to explain it to Grace once, back when they were first married, and she'd asked why he sometimes woke up shouting names she didn't recognize. She'd understood intellectually, but not in her bones, not the way Tori seemed to understand now. Diana had risen from her spot by the fire, moving to stand beside Tori, with a hand on the younger woman's shoulder. The older biker's face carried the wisdom of someone who'd seen her share of grief and learned to carry it with grace. Marines take care of their own. Your father's sacrifice means his family is our family, and that means your fight is our fight. Garrett wanted to protest, wanted to insist he didn't need help and couldn't accept charity, and refused to drag these women into his problems. but the words died in his throat as he looked around the room at 20 faces that had shifted from wary strangers to something approaching kin in the space of a single revelation. Lexi spoke up from her position near the window where she'd been monitoring the storm. "What's the real situation here, Garrett? Why does a Marine with a kid in a lodge full of character look like he's one bad day from losing everything?" Tori shot her a warning glance, but Garrett raised a hand to stop any rebuke. These women had ridden through a killer blizzard and trusted him with their lives. They deserved honesty, even if it cost him the last shreds of pride he'd been clinging to. Banks foreclosing in 10 days, $18,000 owed. Medical bills from my wife's cancer treatment. Pandemic killed my business. Madison Developers has been trying to buy me out for a year, getting more aggressive every month. How aggressive? Aggressive enough to forge inspection violations. Aggressive enough to pressure the bank into expediting foreclosure. Aggressive enough to send their representative up here at 2 in the morning in a blizzard to threaten me. Sarah Mitchell. The weathered engineer crossed her arms with an expression that suggested she'd dealt with corporate predators before and hadn't been impressed. They want your land for something specific. This location means something to their plans. Probably. Haven't cared enough to ask. Just been trying to survive day to day. Tori rebuttoned Garrett's shirt with careful fingers, restoring the fabric over his tattoo as though sealing away a sacred text after reading it aloud. "You're not surviving anymore, Garrett Sullivan. You're fighting, and as of tonight you're not fighting alone." Before he could respond, the sound of an engine cut through the storm's howl. Not motorcycle engines this time, but the aggressive growl of a vehicle with oversized tires churning through deep snow. Headlights swept across the windows, too bright and too deliberate to be accidental. Garrett moved to the window, scraping frost from the glass with his palm. A black Jeep Cherokee with Madison Developers' magnetic sign on the door forced its way up the buried road chains, biting into ice. Richard Coleman had returned, and this time he'd brought company. 2 large men in dark coats emerged from the vehicle, the kind of muscle corporations hired when they wanted to send a message that went beyond legal paperwork. Sophie stirred from her spot against Diana, eyes fluttering open with the instinct children have for sensing when adults are afraid. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Garrett kept his voice calm, controlled the same tone he'd used to brief scared privates before patrols in hostile territory. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just some people who don't understand that midnight visits aren't neighborly." Tori had already moved into position beside him, her body language shifting into something harder and more dangerous than the CEO persona she'd worn when she first arrived. "Want us to stay back or stand with you?" Garrett looked at her, then at the 19 other women who had risen from their resting places and now stood arrayed behind him like an unexpected army. For 3 years he'd handled everything alone, convinced that asking for help meant admitting defeat. But something had changed in the last hour, some fundamental shift in how he understood strength and solidarity. "Stand with me. Marines don't face the enemy alone." The wind hammered against the walls. The foreclosure notice waited under the ledger. Coleman's midnight deadline ticked down toward 0. But for the first time since Grace's funeral, Garrett Sullivan felt something other than isolation pressing down on his shoulders. He felt the weight of 20 women who'd chosen to stand in the gap with him, who'd looked at his Marine Corps tattoo and decided he was worth fighting for. The door shook under Coleman's fist, 3 heavy blows that demanded rather than requested entry. Garrett took a breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward to meet whatever came next with the certain knowledge that he no longer stood alone against the darkness. 4:30 in the morning brought a mechanical cough that Garrett recognized instantly. The generator's death-rattle fuel line frozen solid in temperatures that had dropped to -40 outside. Lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the North Star into darkness, broken only by the stove's fading orange glow. Temperature inside the building had been hovering at 60 degrees. Within an hour it would drop to 50, then 40, then the kind of cold that turned extremities black and made breathing hurt. Sophie woke with a small, frightened sound, immediately seeking her father in the darkness. Garrett scooped her up, wrapping his jacket around her small frame while his mind calculated survival odds that grew worse with each passing second. "It's okay, sweetheart. Generator's acting up. I need to fix it." Tori was already on her feet, pulling on her leather jacket with movements sharp and purposeful, despite being woken from exhausted sleep. Sarah Mitchell had produced a flashlight from her saddlebag, checking the beam with engineer's efficiency. "I'll come with you." 2 sets of hands work faster than one. Garrett wanted to refuse, wanted to insist he could handle it alone the way he'd handled everything for 3 years. But the thermometer on the wall read 58 and falling, and Sophie's teeth were already starting to chatter despite being wrapped in his jacket and Grace's quilt. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford when his daughter's safety hung in the balance. The 3 of them ventured into the blizzard, roped together with climbing cord Sarah produced from seemingly endless supplies in her saddlebag. Visibility extended maybe 5 feet the world beyond, reduced to white chaos and wind that screamed like wounded animals. Garrett led with a compass and muscle memory of a building he'd lived in for 8 years, counting steps to the generator shed while ice formed in his beard and lungs burned with each breath. Sarah's engineering expertise identified the problem within minutes. The fuel line had frozen where it connected to the tank, ice blocking flow completely. They needed to thaw it without cracking the metal, a delicate operation that required steady hands in conditions designed to make hands useless within minutes. Tori held the tarp to shield them from wind while Garrett and Sarah worked, her fingers turning white even inside gloves rated for Arctic conditions. Garrett noticed her starting to shake, fine tremors that signaled the early stages of hypothermia creeping into her core temperature. "We need to get you inside. Finish the job first. Marines don't quit." The phrase hit him like a slap, his own words from hours earlier thrown back with interest. He worked faster using a heat gun Sarah had somehow packed along with half a hardware store's worth of tools. 25 minutes in killing cold hands, going numb, breath coming in labored gasps that turned to ice on contact with air. The fuel line finally surrendered, ice crackling away to restore flow. The generator roared to life, sound beautiful as any symphony Garrett had ever heard. They stumbled back to the lodge, Tori between them as she'd lost most of the feeling in her feet. Diana had hot coffee ready, forced it into their hands while checking for frostbite with the calm competence of someone who'd dealt with medical emergencies on the road. Garrett's fingers throbbed as circulation returned, pain shooting up his arms in waves that made him grit his teeth. Tori sat by the stove, slowly removing boots to reveal toes that had gone dangerously pale. Sarah massaged them carefully, working warmth back into tissue that had come within minutes of permanent damage. "You saved our lives out there, both of you." Tori looked up at Garrett, something shifting in her eyes that went beyond gratitude into territory neither of them seemed ready to name. "We saved each other. That's how it works when you stop trying to do everything alone." Dawn filtered through frosted windows around 6, revealing a landscape transformed into an alien world of white drifts and crystalline beauty that would kill anyone foolish enough to appreciate it unprotected. The radio crackled with updates painting an increasingly grim picture. All roads closed for at least 48 hours, minimum. National Guard mobilizing to rescue stranded motorists on the interstate. 4 confirmed deaths so far from exposure and accidents. Garrett took inventory with Sarah's help, counting cans and packages with grim precision that his supply sergeants would have recognized. Food supplies would last 1.5 days for 22 people if they rationed strictly. Generator fuel might manage 8 hours before they'd be back to the stove and whatever calories they could extract from dwindling supplies. He created a meal plan that would have made his old logistics officers proud, stretching beans and rice and the last of the protein into portions that satisfied hunger without actually filling anyone. The women ate without complaint, understanding that survival sometimes meant going to bed wanting more. Sophie helped Diana organize a drawing circle, teaching the bikers how to create simple sketches to pass time and keep morale up. The child's resilience amazed Garrett, her ability to find joy in circumstances that would have broken many adults. She'd inherited that from Grace, the capacity to make beauty out of hardship and see possibilities when everyone else saw only problems. Tori found him in the storage room around 8 in the morning, checking the propane levels that would determine how long they could keep cooking if the generator failed again. "Can I tell you something I don't share often?" Garrett nodded, setting down the gauge and giving her his full attention. My father died when I was 15. Al Anbar Province, December 2005. You were there when it happened. I remember. Captain Blackwood was the best officer I served under, cared about his men more than his career. Tori's voice went quiet, weighted with old grief that time had dulled but never erased. My mother couldn't handle losing him. Depression swallowed her whole within a year. She died when I was 17. Pills and alcohol, though the death certificate said natural causes because that's what everyone wanted to believe. Christ, Tori, I'm sorry. Aunt Caroline raised me after that. Father's sister, tough Montana rancher who didn't believe in crying over things you couldn't change. I joined the Marines at 18 because I didn't know what else to do with all the anger inside me. You served 4 years. Afghanistan 2010 to 2014. IED took out my Humvee during a patrol outside Kandahar. Broke my back in 3 places, ended my career at 22 with a medical discharge I didn't want. The timeline assembled itself in Garrett's mind, pieces of a life built from tragedy and determination. Tori continued needing to speak more than she needed him to respond. Used my disability settlement and savings to start a tech company in my aunt's garage. Built Blackwood Tech from nothing, reached $50 million in revenue by the time I turned 30. Started Silver Wings 2 years ago to honor my father and help women like my mother who got lost in the grief. You built all that from loss. Grief can destroy you or fuel you. I chose fuel. She looked at him directly, gray eyes searching his face for understanding. What did you choose, Garrett? He thought about the question. Thought about 3 years of going through motions without actually living, of keeping Sophie fed and warm, without remembering how to be warm himself. I chose survival. For her. Surviving isn't living. It's just not dying. The distinction hit harder than he expected, forcing him to acknowledge truths he'd been avoiding since Grace's funeral. He'd survived her death the way he'd survived combat, by shutting down everything except the mission. Keep Sophie safe. Keep the lodge running. Don't feel anything that might crack the armor he'd built from grief and stubbornness. Grace told me not to let grief make me cold. I didn't understand what she meant until just now. Their conversation ended when Sarah called out from the main room, voice carrying urgency that brought both of them running. The engineer had rigged the ham radio from spare parts, cobbling together a transmitter from the lodge's old CB system and components she'd carried in her impossibly well-supplied saddlebags. Got contact with Wyoming Silver Wings chapter. They're mobilizing supplies and riders. ETA 6 hours if the plows clear roads. Hope flickered in the room, fragile but real. Garrett listened as Sarah coordinated with the distant voices, laying out their situation with brutal honesty. 22 people, limited food generator barely functional. The response came back strong and immediate. They were coming with supplies, cash donations from chapters across 3 states, and determination that wouldn't accept failure. Then the weather report crackled through mechanical voice, delivering news that killed hope as quickly as it had risen. Secondary storm system approaching from the northwest. Additional 18 inches of snow expected. Road closure extended minimum 12 additional hours. The math was simple and cruel. Help was coming, but it would arrive too late to prevent real suffering. Garrett began calculating how to stretch 1.5 days of food across 2, how to keep people warm when the generator fuel ran out, how to maintain morale when the numbers refused to add up to survival. 7 hours crawled past in tense preparation and rationed activity. The women organized into teams, some managing the stove's precious heat, others monitoring the generator's fuel consumption, still others keeping Sophie entertained and distracted from adult fears. Diana led quiet songs that kept spirits up. Lexi told improbable stories about cross-country rides that made even the darkest moments feel temporary. 11 in the morning arrived with the sound of engines cutting through the storm's diminished howl. But these weren't the synchronized thunder of motorcycle convoys bringing salvation. This was the aggressive growl of Coleman's Jeep Cherokee, and this time he'd brought official authority. Sheriff Tom Brennan's vehicle followed the black Jeep up the mountain, 4-wheel drive, churning through drifts that had grown another foot overnight. Garrett watched them approach with sinking dread, knowing that legitimate law enforcement complicated everything in ways forged documents hadn't. He opened the door before the first knock finished filling the frame with his body to block any view of Sophie or the women behind him. Cold air slammed into his face, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. "Mr. Sullivan, got a complaint about overcrowding and potential child endangerment. Need to conduct a welfare check." Sheriff Brennan was a stocky man in his 50s, weathered face, partially hidden beneath a regulation winter hat. He entered the lodge with professional courtesy, nodding to the assembled women before turning back to Garrett with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Coleman stood behind the sheriff, barely containing his satisfaction at having found a legal angle after his forgery attempt had failed spectacularly 12 hours earlier. "As you can see, Sheriff, we're managing an emergency situation. These riders got caught in the blizzard. I provided shelter under Good Samaritan provisions." Tori rose from her seat, moving with the confident grace of someone who knew how to work a room and wasn't intimidated by badges or authority. "Sheriff Brennan, I believe your department uses Blackwood Tech body cameras. The BT 4000 series, correct?" Recognition crossed the sheriff's face, followed by surprise that transformed into something approaching respect. "Ms. Blackwood, what are you doing all the way up here, surviving a Category 5 blizzard same as everyone else, and ensuring Mr. Sullivan's rights are protected during what appears to be continued harassment from Madison developers?" The sheriff's demeanor shifted his professional assessment, taking in details Coleman had failed to mention or deliberately omitted. These weren't random vagrants or troublemakers creating a dangerous situation. These were organized, disciplined women from a nonprofit organization his department had worked with on domestic violence cases. And their leader was the CEO, who'd personally donated camera systems that had saved 3 deputies from false accusations in the past year. Coleman sensed the change, tried to regain control of a situation slipping away from him. "The building codes are clear, Sheriff. Maximum occupancy regulations state, this is an emergency shelter situation during a declared natural disaster. Mr. Coleman, Good Samaritan laws supersede occupancy limits when lives are at stake." "But the child's welfare." The sheriff walked over to where Sophie sat with Diana, the little girl happily drawing pictures of motorcycles and eagles while the silver-haired biker offered gentle encouragement. He crouched to her level voice, softening in the way of parents who understood how to talk to children. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" "Yes, sir. Miss Diana is teaching me how to draw wings, and Daddy made really good chili last night, even though we didn't have very much." "You warm enough? Getting enough to eat? Everyone shares their blankets, and Daddy says sharing means nobody goes hungry, even if we all go to bed a little bit wanting more." Brennan stood facing Coleman with an expression that suggested professional patience wearing dangerously thin. "I see Americans helping each other survive a natural disaster, Mr. Coleman. That's not a crime. That's what we're supposed to do." Coleman pulled the sheriff aside for a whispered conversation that Garrett couldn't hear, but could read in body language and the subtle shifts of power between men. Money didn't change hands, but promises did, favors called in or threatened. The sheriff's face remained impassive, giving nothing away as Coleman spoke urgently into his ear. When they separated, Brennan approached Garrett with something that might have been an apology in his eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm leaving an emergency propane heater from my vehicle. Consider it a county loan until this storm passes and roads clear. Beyond that, I don't see any violations requiring immediate action." He glanced at Coleman with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask underlying contempt. "Anything beyond a welfare check requires actual court orders. Real ones with proper signatures and case numbers. I suggest you follow proper legal procedures, Mr. Coleman." Coleman's face flushed red rage and humiliation, warring for dominance. He stormed toward the door, shoulder deliberately checking one of the bikers hard enough to make her stumble. Sarah caught the woman, steadied her, then fixed Coleman with a look that could have stripped paint off steel. "You might want to watch where you're going." Coleman spun, finger jabbing toward Garrett with barely controlled fury. 9 days, Sullivan. Enjoy your biker friends while you can. When the bank takes this place, you'll have nothing. Absolutely nothing." The door slammed behind him, rattling windows in their frames. Sheriff Brennan lingered, helping carry in the propane heater with several of the women who'd volunteered to assist. Before he left, he pulled Garrett aside where others couldn't hear. "My son is a Marine. Afghanistan 2012. Came home with PTSD so bad he couldn't hold a job, couldn't sleep without nightmares tearing him apart. Silver Wings helped him when the VA couldn't get him an appointment for 6 months. He adjusted his hat eyes, meeting Garrett's with the frank assessment of one veteran recognizing another. Coleman has connections at the state level, but he crossed a line today trying to use my office for his corporate bullshit. You need help, you call me direct, not dispatch me. He handed over a card with his personal cell number scrawled on the back in pen that had nearly run dry, then trudged out to his vehicle and disappeared into the storm that showed no signs of relenting. Lexi had her laptop open within minutes of Coleman's departure, fingers flying across keys with the focused intensity of someone hunting prey through digital forests. She'd planted a keylogger USB device in Coleman's laptop during his first visit, a piece of hardware small enough to hide in plain sight and sophisticated enough to transmit data whenever the target device connected to any network. The women gathered around as Lexi projected her findings onto the laptop screen, each revelation more damning than the last. Madison developers had purchased 6 properties along the ridge over the past 18 months, each acquisition following the same pattern. Mysterious violations appearing in county records, pressure on local banks to expedite foreclosures, owners forced to sell at fractions of actual value. She zoomed in on an email chain that made Garrett's blood run cold. Parcel 7. Critical for corridor access. Without Sullivan property, grand entrance design fails completely. Resort cannot proceed. Investors will pull $200 million in funding if access corridor is compromised. The revelation hung in the air, transforming Coleman's harassment from opportunistic bullying into calculated corporate warfare. Madison didn't just want the North Star. They needed it desperately enough to break laws and forge documents and risk everything on forcing one stubborn Marine to surrender. Lexi kept digging, pulling up more emails that painted an increasingly damning picture of systematic fraud. They've been fabricating violations for 18 months. Every health inspection complaint, every zoning issue, every permit problem, all manufactured. Look at this exchange. She highlighted an email from Coleman to someone named Howard at First Mountain Bank dated 6 months prior. Need Sullivan property for access corridor. Expedite foreclosure. Will compensate appropriately for cooperation. The response came from Howard's official bank email address, professional and damning in its brevity. Understood. Will flag account for accelerated review. Violations can be found if needed. Sarah Mitchell studied the screen with engineer's precision, analyzing data points until patterns emerged that told a larger story. They've done this before. Look at these other properties along the ridge. Same tactics, same timeline, same people involved. 3 businesses folded and sold cheap within 6 months. One fought back and had a mysterious fire 6 months later that destroyed everything. Garrett felt rage building in his chest, the kind he hadn't experienced since combat, when rules of engagement prevented him from protecting civilians being used as human shields by enemies who understood America's reluctance to accept collateral damage. They systematically destroyed my business piece by piece, made me think I was failing when reality was I'd been fighting a rigged game designed for me to lose from the start. Tori placed a hand on his arm, gentle but grounding, keeping him anchored to the present instead of drowning in fury. Now we know their plan. We can fight it with evidence instead of just determination. Law didn't help when they forged documents, when they bribed inspectors and pressured banks. What makes you think it'll help now because you're not alone anymore? We fight together with lawyers and evidence and the kind of coordinated effort that corporations don't expect from their victims. The sentiment was noble, but Garrett's tactical mind saw the brutal reality. They had evidence of corporate malfeasance that could destroy Coleman and maybe Madison developers. But Coleman had 9 days to execute foreclosure before any investigation could stop him. Evidence meant nothing if the bank seized the property first and forced litigation that could drag on for years while Madison built their resort and buried the truth under concrete and tourist dollars. Lexi's fingers froze over the keyboard, her face going pale in a way that made everyone stop talking and turn to look. Garrett. Tori. You need to see this right now. She projected a new email chain onto the wall. This one heavily encrypted but cracked by software she'd written herself during her more legally questionable years. The sender's address was masked behind multiple proxies, but the signature line made Garrett's blood run cold. Office of Regional Economic Development, State Level. The message was brief and carried weight that transformed everything they thought they understood. Parcel 7 acquisition essential for Interstate Corridor Expansion Project. Federal highway funding contingent on securing access rights through Sullivan property. Use all available pressure. This directive comes from the top. Failure is not acceptable. Tori's face hardened into the expression she probably wore in boardrooms when competitors made the mistake of underestimating her. This isn't just corporate greed. This is government-backed land acquisition disguised as private development. Coleman's just the front man for something much bigger. Diana stood from her seat near the stove, moving to examine the email with eyes that had seen enough political corruption in her 40 years as a teacher to recognize it instantly. If federal highway funding is involved, that means someone at the state level promised to deliver this property. When governments want land, they usually use eminent domain. The fact they're using Coleman and Madison suggests they can't legally take it through official channels. Why not? It's just a lodge on a mountain road. Sarah's engineering mind connected dots faster than anyone else in the room. Because you're a veteran. Because taking a veteran-owned business through eminent domain for a luxury resort would create political backlash they can't afford. So they manufacture a foreclosure instead, make it look like natural business failure, and nobody asks questions about who benefits. The scope of the conspiracy expanded beyond anything Garrett had imagined. This wasn't just Coleman being aggressive, or Madison developers being predatory. This was coordinated effort between corporate interests and government officials to steal his property while maintaining plausible deniability. Lexi dug deeper, tracing the masked sender's digital fingerprints through proxies and encryption layers that should have been impenetrable. 10 minutes of focused work that felt like hours, then her face went even paler. The email originated from a state government server. Whoever sent this has access to official infrastructure and isn't worried about being traced because they think they're untouchable. Can you identify who sent it? Not without better access to state systems, which would be extremely illegal even by my flexible standards. But I can tell you it came from someone high enough to authorize use of secure government email for what amounts to conspiracy to commit fraud. Tori pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts before selecting one and putting the call on speaker. The voice that answered was female, crisp, and carrying the no-nonsense authority of someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. Jennifer Reeves. What legal chaos are you orchestrating now? Judge Patterson. I need an emergency stay on a foreclosure proceeding in your district. First Mountain Bank versus Garrett Sullivan. Patricia Patterson's laugh cut through the phone, warm but sharp enough to draw blood if you weren't careful. The Sullivan case. Richard Coleman has been in my office twice this week trying to expedite that order. I told him to follow proper procedure and stop wasting my time with rush requests that skip due process. Your Honor, we have evidence suggesting the underlying violations used to justify foreclosure were fabricated as part of a conspiracy between Madison Developers Bank personnel and possibly state government officials. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 5 seconds, long enough for Garrett to wonder if they'd lost the connection. When Judge Patterson spoke again, her tone had shed all warmth and carried the weight of judicial authority pushed toward the limits of patience. Submit your evidence within 2 hours. I'll review personally and issue a ruling by 1600. If what you're telling me is accurate, Mr. Coleman is going to wish he'd chosen a different county for his version of legal practice. The call ended. Tori looked at Garrett with satisfaction that reminded him of snipers he'd known who took pride in difficult shots executed perfectly under pressure. We have until 4 this afternoon to build an airtight case. Let's get to work. 3 o'clock in the afternoon brought Coleman's voice over Garrett's cell phone, the device vibrating with an incoming call he considered ignoring, but curiosity won out over caution. I know Silver Wings is coming, Sullivan. Doesn't matter. By tomorrow noon, I'll have the foreclosure order signed by Judge Patterson. Real signatures this time, proper procedure, everything legal and binding. Garrett's hand tightened on the phone knuckles, going white with controlled rage. Last offer before this gets ugly. Sign the deed. Take 30,000 cash, walk away tomorrow with enough to start over somewhere else. Or lose everything with nothing and watch your daughter learn what failure looks like. I'd rather lose fighting than win by surrendering what matters most. You're not thinking about Sophie. What happens when she's homeless because her father's pride mattered more than her future? When you've failed her, the way you failed your wife by not being able to save her. The words were designed to wound surgical strikes aimed at guilt Garrett carried like shrapnel embedded too deep to remove. The accusation that he'd failed Grace by not saving her from cancer, failed Sophie by not maintaining the business Grace had helped him build, failed as a father and husband and man who couldn't protect the people he loved from the world's cruelty. He ended the call without responding. Hand shaking with rage he had no productive outlet for. Coleman knew exactly which buttons to push, which old wounds to reopen, which fears to weaponize against a man already fighting on too many fronts. Garrett went to the back storage room to be alone, needing distance from concerned eyes and well-meaning offers of support that felt like pity. His fist hit the wall once, a single release of frustration that left his knuckles bleeding but did nothing to solve the fundamental problem. 9 days. $30,000 versus $18,000 owed, plus legal fees, plus 3 years of accumulated grief, plus the weight of promises made to a dying woman who'd believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. Tori found him sitting against the wall, head in hands, shoulders shaking with emotions he'd kept locked away since the funeral. She didn't speak, just sat beside him in the cold storage room and waited with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes silence was the only gift worth giving. The quiet stretched until Garrett's voice broke it raw and unsteady. I promised Grace. Standing right here in this room, watching her get weaker every day, knowing I couldn't stop it, I promised I'd give Sophie a home. I'm failing her the same way I failed her mother. You gave her a father who fights even when the odds are impossible. That's more than a building or a business. What if fighting isn't enough? What if Coleman's right, and I'm just being stubborn, throwing away $30,000 that could keep her fed and clothed, while I figure something else out? Tori took his hand, calloused palm against calloused palm. Two veterans who understood that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones without clear enemies or defined objectives. Then we fight harder. Together. You're not carrying this alone anymore, Garrett Sullivan. You need to stop acting like you are. Sophie's voice interrupted them, small and uncertain, from the doorway where she'd been searching for her father. Daddy, why are you crying? Garrett hadn't realized tears were streaming down his face. 3 years of accumulated grief finally finding an outlet in the presence of people he was learning to trust. Sophie crossed the storage room and climbed into his lap, her 8-year-old weight somehow anchoring him to the present instead of the past. She held up a drawing she'd been working on, the North Star surrounded by motorcycles forming a protective circle like shields in a formation. For you and Miss Tori. Mommy told me when things get scary, good people show up to help. They showed up, Daddy. You just have to let them. The simple faith in his daughter's voice broke something open in Garrett's chest, something that had been sealed shut since Grace's funeral. He pulled Sophie close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the faint smell of wood smoke that permeated everything in the lodge. You're right, sweetheart. We're not alone anymore. Sophie looked at Tori with the solemn assessment children reserve for adults. They're deciding whether to trust completely. Are you going to help my daddy? Yes, I promise. Good. He needs help. He's too stubborn to ask for it himself. Mommy used to say that all the time. All three of them laughed through tears, the kind of release that came from acknowledging hard truths with people who cared enough to speak them. Diana appeared in the doorway with mugs of hot coffee, having given them space, but not so much that Garrett could spiral into the kind of isolation that had defined the past 3 years. Wyoming chapter confirmed arrival time. 4 hours if the secondary storm holds off long enough for plows to get through. Garrett did the math quickly. $25,000 in cash donations raised in 6 hours across multiple chapters. Combined with what he could scrape together, it might clear the debt with enough left over for legal fees to fight Coleman's tactics in court, where evidence mattered more than corporate pressure. Colorado chapter is 3 hours out. 15 riders complete lawyer team, $12,000 more in emergency funds. The numbers kept improving, support materializing from women he'd never met who'd decided his fight mattered because Marines took care of their own, and Tori Blackwood had declared him worth defending. Sarah coordinated logistics with military precision, plotting arrival times and resource distribution like a campaign battle plan designed to overwhelm opposition through superior coordination. But the weather refused to cooperate with human timelines or desperate hopes. The secondary storm cell hit at 5 in the evening, another 18 inches of snow dumped on roads the plows hadn't even started clearing from the first blizzard. The Wyoming chapter called to report they'd made it to the base of the mountain but couldn't proceed further without risking lives. The Colorado team was stopped 20 miles out, waiting for National Guard to clear a massive pileup blocking the only viable route. Help was coming with money and lawyers and determination, but it would arrive too late to prevent the suffering that night would bring. Garrett began rationing what little food remained, dividing beans and rice into portions that would keep people alive without actually satisfying hunger. The generator coughed at 7 fuel gauge, dropping toward empty despite his best efforts to conserve every drop. Sophie fell asleep against Diana around 8, exhausted from a day of managing fear she was too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense in every adult face. Garrett covered her with Grace's quilt, the fabric worn thin from years of use, but still carrying traces of his wife's perfume if he concentrated hard enough and let himself remember. Tori found him by the dying fire around 9, neither of them able to sleep, despite exhaustion that went bone deep. They sat in companionable silence, watching embers fade while the storm raged outside with renewed fury that suggested nature itself had taken sides against them. "Why are you really doing this? You barely know me beyond a few conversations and shared crisis. I know you're a Marine who kept his promise to his wife even when it cost you everything. You opened your door to strangers in a storm knowing you had nothing left to give. You're raising a daughter to be brave and kind in a world that rewards neither." She paused, something vulnerable crossing her face in the firelight. "You're the kind of man my father was. The kind worth fighting for even when the fight seems impossible. When this is over, when we're not managing crisis mode every second, I'd like to get to know you better. Really know you, not just survival partnership know you." Tori smiled, the expression transforming her face from CEO armor into something softer and more dangerous to Garrett's carefully maintained emotional distance. "I'd like that, Garrett Sullivan. I'd like that very much." 4 in the morning arrived with frost forming on interior walls. Despite the propane heater, Sheriff Brennan had left breath visible even near the stove, where they'd consolidated everyone for maximum warmth. Garrett had burned through the emergency wood supply, watching flames die while calculating how long 22 people could survive in a building that had become a glorified icebox. Sophie stirred against him, mumbling something about eagles and motorcycles in her sleep, innocent dreams untainted by adult fears. Tori's hand found his in the darkness, squeezed once in silent solidarity that had become their language when words failed. Then, cutting through the silence like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors, Garrett's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, assuming Coleman had found a new way to torment him, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end was female, crisp, authoritative, wide awake, despite the ungodly hour. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Judge Patricia Patterson. I apologize for calling at 4 in the morning, but I've been reviewing documents related to your foreclosure case for the past 6 hours. Mr. Coleman made several critical errors filing his emergency petition." Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs, hardly daring to hope. "What kind of errors, Your Honor?" "The kind that suggests he's not just unethical but desperate enough to make mistakes. Forged inspector signatures, backdated violation notices, fabricated communication with my office. I'm issuing a stay effective immediately. We'll have oral arguments tomorrow at 1400 hours via secure video link." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice carried warning wrapped in judicial authority. "Be ready to fight, Mr. Sullivan, because based on what I'm seeing, someone very powerful wants your property, and they don't care who they destroy to get it. But they made the mistake of trying to manipulate my court, and I take that extremely personally." The call ended. Garrett stared at the phone, Tori's eyes meeting his in the darkness, both of them processing what had just happened. What was that? We got a chance. Maybe our only one? but it's real. Outside, the first hint of dawn touched the mountains, painting snow in shades of blood and gold that promised either salvation or final reckoning. The storm had finally spent its fury, leaving behind a world buried but strangely peaceful in the aftermath of violence. Garrett held Sophie closer, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and allowed himself to believe that sometimes stubbornness and community and the refusal to surrender could actually be enough. Dawn crept through frost-covered windows at 6 in the morning, revealing a world buried under snow that had finally stopped falling. The temperature inside the North Star had dropped to 42 degrees, cold enough that everyone's breath hung visible but not yet lethal. Garrett had burned the last log an hour before sunrise, watching the final flames die while calculating how long 22 people could survive in a building that had become a glorified icebox. The rumble of engines cut through the silence, distant at first, then growing louder with each passing second. Not the aggressive growl of Coleman's Jeep, but the synchronized thunder of multiple motorcycles and heavy vehicles pushing through cleared roads. Garrett moved to the window, hardly daring to believe what his ears told him. Wyoming chapter had broken through. 20 riders on bikes modified for winter riding, followed by 2 pickup trucks loaded with supplies and a portable generator strapped down in one bed. Behind them came the Colorado contingent, 15 more riders, and a SUV carrying 3 women in business attire who could only be the lawyer team Diana had mentioned. The relief that swept through the lodge was almost physical, people rising from huddled positions near the dead stove to crowd the windows. Sophie woke and immediately ran to see the commotion, her face lighting up with excitement that had been absent for the past 24 hours. "Daddy, look how many motorcycles!" The riders dismounted with military precision, unloading supplies in an organized chain that spoke to years of coordinated operations. Diana coordinated from the porch, directing traffic like a field commander, while Sarah helped install the portable generator. Within 30 minutes, lights flickered back on, and heat began circulating through vents that hadn't functioned since midnight. Tori greeted the chapter leaders with embraces that carried the weight of shared history, introducing each one to Garrett with brief descriptions that conveyed volumes. Cassandra from Wyoming, former Army medic who'd served 3 tours in Iraq. Jennifer from Colorado, corporate lawyer who'd left a partnership to do advocacy work. Rachel, Beth. Catherine. Each name attached to a face that held its own story of survival and determination. The hot food they'd brought tasted like salvation. Simple scrambled eggs and bacon and toast that everyone ate slowly, savoring flavors that seemed impossible after 2 days of rationing beans and desperation. Sophie sat between Diana and one of the newer arrivals, chattering about her drawings, while the woman listened with the patience of someone who understood how much children needed normalcy during chaos. Jennifer, the lead attorney, set up a makeshift office at one of the tables, spreading documents across scarred wood, while Kate Donovan from her team pulled out a laptop. Both women wore expressions that suggested they'd litigated cases in far worse conditions and considered this almost pleasant by comparison. "Mr. Sullivan, we need to review everything. Every interaction with Coleman, every document Madison Developers has presented, every suspicious inspection or violation claim." Garrett spent 2 hours walking them through 18 months of accumulated harassment, starting with the first friendly offer to buy the property and escalating through increasingly aggressive tactics. Jennifer took notes with the focused intensity of someone building a case, asking questions that revealed angles Garrett hadn't considered. "These inspection violations, did you ever receive copies of the actual reports, or just notice of fines?" "Just the notices. They said the reports were available at the county office, but every time I went to request them, the clerk couldn't find the files." Jennifer and Kate exchanged looks that Garrett recognized from his time working with JAG officers in the Marines. They'd found something significant, a crack in Coleman's armor that could be exploited. "That's a due process violation. You can't be fined for violations you're not allowed to see or contest. Every one of these could be grounds for dismissal." Lexi approached with her laptop, having spent the morning digging deeper into Madison Developers' digital footprint now that she had reliable power and internet access. She projected emails onto the wall, walking through a timeline that painted Coleman as either incompetent or criminally negligent. "He's been communicating with someone at the bank using a personal email address, not the official Madison account." Look at this exchange from 6 months ago. The email was brief and damning. Need Sullivan property for access corridor. Expedite foreclosure. Will compensate appropriately for cooperation. The response came from someone named Howard at First Mountain Bank. Understood. Will flag account for accelerated review. Violations can be found if needed. Jennifer's expression shifted from professional interest to predatory focus. That's conspiracy to commit fraud. Possibly extortion depending on what compensation changed hands. We can file emergency injunctions based on this alone, but will it stop tomorrow's foreclosure deadline? Coleman said he'd have Judge Patterson sign the order by noon. Jennifer pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts before selecting one and putting the call on speaker. The voice that answered was female, crisp and no nonsense. Jennifer Reeves. What legal chaos are you orchestrating now? Judge Patterson, I need an emergency stay on a foreclosure proceeding in your district. First Mountain Bank versus Garrett Sullivan case number. Patricia Patterson's laugh cut through the phone, warm but sharp. The Sullivan case. Richard Coleman has been in my office twice this week trying to expedite that order. I told him to follow proper procedure and stop wasting my time with rush requests that skip due process. Your Honor, we have evidence suggesting the underlying violations used to justify foreclosure were fabricated as part of a conspiracy between Madison developers and bank personnel. The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds, long enough for Garrett to wonder if they'd lost the connection. When Judge Patterson spoke again, her tone had shed all warmth. Submit your evidence within 2 hours. I'll review and issue a ruling by 1600. If what you're telling me is accurate, Mr. Coleman is going to wish he'd chosen a different county to practice his version of law. The call ended. Jennifer looked at Garrett with satisfaction that reminded him of snipers he'd known who took pride in difficult shots executed perfectly. We have until 4 this afternoon to build an airtight case. Let's get to work. The next hours passed in controlled chaos as the legal team assembled evidence, cross-referenced documents, and built arguments designed to stop Coleman's foreclosure attempt cold. Garrett found himself relegated to supporting role, answering questions and providing context, while professionals dismantled the corporate machinery that had been crushing him for 18 months. Tori worked alongside him, helping organize paperwork and offering insights from her own experience fighting corporate battles. At one point, she pulled him aside, away from the controlled frenzy of legal preparation. How are you holding up? Honestly, I feel useless. All these people working to save my home, and I'm just standing here watching. You brought us together. You opened your door when you had every reason to lock it. Everything else flows from that choice. I didn't choose anything. I just couldn't let 20 people freeze to death. That's what choosing looks like when you're the kind of person who doesn't think about it first. Grace chose well when she married you. The observation landed with unexpected weight, forcing Garrett to consider that maybe his actions in the blizzard hadn't been weakness or desperation, but rather the expression of values Grace had seen in him even when he couldn't see them himself. She'd always believed in him more than he believed in himself, right up until the morphine took away her ability to believe in anything. Noon arrived with the legal team still working, coffee consumption reaching levels that concerned the medics in the group. Jennifer had assembled a document package that looked substantial enough to stop a tank, complete with email evidence, testimony statements, and legal precedents that filled 40 pages of dense text. Kate handled the electronic filing while Jennifer made another call to Judge Patterson's chambers, confirming receipt and requesting oral arguments if needed. The response came back within minutes. Oral arguments scheduled for 1400. All parties to appear virtually via secure video link. Coleman received notification at 12:15, his response arriving via angry text to Garrett's phone 30 seconds after the court email landed. You're making a mistake, Sullivan. This changes nothing. I'll bury you in legal fees even if you win today. Garrett showed the message to Jennifer, who smiled with the cold satisfaction of a lawyer who'd just been handed evidence of witness intimidation. Please keep sending these, Mr. Coleman. Each one strengthens our case for sanctions and damages. The video hearing began precisely at 2, Judge Patricia Patterson's face appearing on the laptop screen with an expression that suggested she'd already reviewed the evidence and formed preliminary opinions. Coleman appeared in a separate window flanked by two lawyers who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the hearing progressed. Jennifer presented the case with surgical precision, walking through each piece of evidence and connecting them into a pattern of conspiracy that left no room for innocent misinterpretation. She entered the emails into the record, highlighted the due process violations, and demonstrated how Madison developers had systematically manufactured a crisis to force a sale at below market value. Coleman's attorneys tried to deflect, arguing that business communications couldn't be construed as criminal conspiracy, that inspection violations were legitimate, even if paperwork was mishandled, that foreclosure proceedings were standard banking practice. Judge Patterson let them speak without interruption, her expression growing colder with each word. Mr. Coleman, did you or did you not communicate with bank employee Howard regarding expedited foreclosure in exchange for compensation? Those communications were taken out of context. Yes or no? Mr. Coleman, we had business discussions about property valuation. I'll ask one more time. Did you offer compensation to a bank employee to expedite foreclosure proceedings against Mr. Sullivan? Coleman's lawyers tried to intervene, but Judge Patterson cut them off with a gesture. Your client will answer the question or I'll hold him in contempt. Coleman's face flushed, red jaw working as he calculated odds and apparently decided honesty served him better than perjury. I may have suggested that cooperation would be remembered favorably. Judge Patterson's expression could have frozen water in summer. That's bribery, Mr. Coleman, and this court takes an exceptionally dim view of individuals who attempt to manipulate legal proceedings through fraudulent means. Foreclosure is stayed pending full investigation. Mr. Sullivan's loan is placed under review. Madison Developers is barred from any contact with the property or its owner. She turned her attention to Jennifer. Ms. Reeves, your client has grounds for substantial civil damages. I suggest you pursue them vigorously. This court will cooperate fully with any criminal referral to the district attorney. The hearing ended with Coleman's lawyers scrambling to minimize damage while their client sat frozen in his window, the reality of consequences apparently exceeding his capacity to process them. Garrett watched the screen go dark, hardly believing what had just transpired. Tori hugged him hard enough to force air from his lungs, followed by Diana and Sarah, and women whose names he was still learning but whose presence had become essential to his survival. Sophie danced around the room, picking up on adult excitement without fully understanding its source. We won, Daddy. We get to keep our home. We won this round, sweetheart. And that's enough for today. Jennifer closed her laptop with satisfaction that suggested she'd notch another victory on whatever mental scoreboard lawyers maintained. Judge Patterson will likely refer Coleman for criminal investigation. The emails constitute conspiracy to commit fraud, at minimum possibly extortion, depending on what actually changed hands. Madison Developers will face regulatory scrutiny that could destroy their entire development project. What about the $18,000 I owe the bank is required to conduct full review of the loan and all associated fees. Given the irregularities, I'd estimate they'll forgive at least half and restructure the remainder at favorable terms. Nobody wants the publicity of being connected to Coleman's schemes. Garrett sank into a chair, the adrenaline that had sustained him for 3 days finally draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. The North Star was safe. Sophie's home was protected. He hadn't failed Grace's memory or broken his promise. The relief should have felt triumphant, but mostly it just felt like he could finally breathe without a boot on his chest. That evening, James Hartley called from First Mountain Bank, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone attempting damage control before lawyers made everything worse. Mr. Sullivan, I want to personally apologize for the irregularities in your loan servicing. Howard acted without authorization and has been terminated. We're conducting full internal review. What does that mean for my loan? Given the manufactured violations and improper pressure, the bank is prepared to forgive $12,000 of the principal and restructure the remaining $6,000 at 2% interest over 10 years. We're also removing all late fees and penalties. The numbers took a moment to process. $18,000 in debt, reduced to $6,000 on terms he could actually manage. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was survival. There's something else you should know. Howard was working as a middleman for Cordell Industries. They own Madison Developers plus 12 other development companies across 6 states. They've used similar tactics on 47 veteran-owned businesses. Your case broke the pattern. FBI is opening a RICO investigation. Garrett's hand tightened on the phone. I just wanted to save my home. Hartley's voice softened. Sometimes one person's stand changes everything. The FBI found evidence of systematic fraud across multiple states. Your refusal to surrender may have saved dozens of other businesses from the same fate. The call ended with promises of paperwork and formal agreements, leaving Garrett staring at his phone and trying to comprehend that his fight had been larger than he'd understood. Tori found him on the porch where he'd gone to process the information. Her presence a comfort he was starting to depend on in ways that both excited and terrified him. 47 businesses. Coleman and Cordell destroyed 47 families because I happened to own land they needed for a resort entrance. And you stopped them. That matters, Garrett. Does it? Those 47 families are still destroyed. I just got lucky that you showed up in a blizzard. Tori took his hand, the same gesture she'd offered in the storage room when he'd been drowning in grief and defeat. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You prepared by being the kind of man who opens doors instead of locking them. The opportunity came because you'd built something worth fighting for. The words settled into spaces in Garrett's chest that had been empty since Grace died, filling them with something that felt dangerously close to hope. He turned to face Tori, fully seeing past the CEO armor to the woman who'd ridden through a killer storm and chosen to stand with a stranger because Marines didn't abandon their own. When this settles, when everyone goes back to their lives and the North Star is just a lodge again instead of a war zone, I'd like to take you to dinner. Real dinner, not beans and rationed coffee. Tori smiled, genuine warmth transforming her face. I'd like that. Though I should warn you, I'm considering relocating Blackwood Tech's regional office to Colorado. Tech companies can operate from anywhere, and I'm finding the mountain views compelling. Just the views. Well, the company's not bad either. They stood together watching the sun sit over mountains that had tried to kill them all and failed, the kind of sunset Grace had loved before cancer stole her capacity to appreciate beauty. Garrett thought about the quilt Sophie slept under, the one sewn with tiny stars that represented hopes and dreams from a time when the future seemed unlimited. Grace had believed in building things that lasted, in creating shelter, not just from weather, but from the casual cruelty of a world that didn't care who it crushed. The North Star had been her dream as much as his, a place where travelers could find warmth and strangers could become friends. He'd nearly lost it by trying to defend it alone, by believing that accepting help meant admitting defeat. Tori and Diana and Sarah and 40 other women had taught him that strength sometimes meant knowing when to let others carry part of the weight. The Silver Wings chapters began departing over the next 2 days, each group leaving with promises to return and offers of support that extended beyond the immediate crisis. Wyoming chapter left their portable generator as a backup, refusing payment despite Garrett's protests. Colorado team connected him with contractors who specialized in veteran-owned business rehabilitation volunteers who'd help make improvements he'd been deferring for years. Diana stayed, declaring her intention to make the North Star a permanent base while she figured out what retired meant for someone who'd spent 40 years teaching and 10 more writing. Sophie had adopted her as a surrogate grandmother, a role Diana embraced with fierce tenderness that suggested she'd been missing family as much as the little girl needed extended relatives. Lexi departed with a hug and a warning. I left some security software on your systems. If Coleman or anyone from Madison tries to access your network, I'll know. And then they'll regret it. Sarah pressed a card into Garrett's hand, her weathered face creasing with a smile. You ever need engineering work, you call. Marines help Marines. And Tori says you're one of the good ones. The lodge felt simultaneously emptier and fuller after the exodus, fewer bodies but more presence somehow. The women who'd stayed had transformed from strangers into something approaching family, the kind forged in crisis rather than blood, but no less real for it. Tori remained through the end of the week, working remotely while ostensibly overseeing the transition, but mostly just being present in ways that made Garrett realize how profoundly lonely he'd been. They fell into rhythms without discussing them, morning coffee prepared in comfortable silence, evening conversations that ranged from trivial to profound, depending on whether Sophie was listening. One night after Sophie had gone to bed, Garrett found the courage to speak truths he'd been avoiding. "Grace told me not to let grief make me cold. I didn't understand what she meant until you knocked on my door in a blizzard. She saw you clearly even at the end. That's a gift. I thought loving her meant staying frozen in the moment she died, like moving forward would dishonor her memory." Tori's eyes held understanding that came from her own navigation of loss and survival. "Moving forward isn't betrayal. It's honoring what she wanted for you and Sophie. She married a man who built things and opened doors and believed shelter mattered. Be that man. I don't know if I remember how. Then we'll figure it out together." That's what partnerships look like when neither person has all the answers. The word partnership hung between them, weighted with implications neither seemed ready to fully examine, but neither wanted to dismiss. Garrett reached across the space separating them, taking Tori's hand with tentative hope that felt dangerous and necessary. "Stay. Not just this week. Stay and build something with us. My company can operate from anywhere. And Sophie deserves to see what it looks like when someone shows up and stays." They kissed with the careful tenderness of people who'd both lost too much to risk themselves lightly, but who'd also learned that safety sometimes meant the biggest risk was never trying at all. When they separated, Garrett saw tears on Tori's cheeks that matched the ones he hadn't realized were streaming down his own face. 6 months dissolved between moments like snow and spring sun, the kind of time that felt both endless and impossibly brief. The North Star underwent transformation that reflected both necessity and hope. Structural repairs that had been deferred for years finally completed alongside aesthetic improvements that made the lodge feel less like a last stand and more like a destination. Garrett stood behind the bar on a June morning watching through clean windows as Sophie helped Diana tend the garden they'd planted in March. The little girl had Grace's gift for making things grow, her enthusiasm for dirt and seeds translating into tomatoes and peppers that would supplement the kitchen's offerings come August. The sign outside had changed, weathered boards replaced with carved wood that proclaimed Sentinel's Rest in letters Sophie had helped design. "Veteran-owned, motorcycle-friendly family lodge," read the smaller text beneath an invitation to the kinds of travelers who valued character over corporate polish. 30 bikes sat in the expanded parking area, a mix of Silver Wings members passing through and independent riders who'd heard about the place through word of mouth. The restaurant hummed with conversation strangers, becoming friends over plates of food Garrett had learned to cook in quantities that actually turned profit instead of just preventing starvation. Tori emerged from the back office she'd converted into Blackwood Tech's regional headquarters laptop, tucked under one arm and phone pressed to her ear as she negotiated contracts with the calm authority that had built a $50 million company from a garage in Montana. She'd relocated fully in April, selling her Seattle condo and moving her life to Colorado with the same decisive efficiency she brought to everything. Sophie had taken to calling her Aunt Tori within a month, a title that acknowledged relationship without forcing premature labels that none of them were quite ready for. Garrett watched them together, sometimes seeing how naturally Tori had slipped into the role of co-parent, helping with homework and motorcycle maintenance lessons in equal measure. The engagement ring had been Grace's, the one she'd worn until her fingers grew too swollen from medication. Garrett had kept it in his nightstand for 3 years, unable to look at it but incapable of letting it go. He'd shown it to Sophie first, asking permission he didn't technically need but felt essential to request. "What do you think, sweetheart? Would it be okay if I asked Aunt Tori to stay with us forever?" Sophie had considered the question with 8-year-old seriousness, thinking through implications that would affect her as much as either adult. "Mommy would want you to be happy, and Aunt Tori makes you smile like you used to before Mommy got sick." So yes, the proposal happened on the deck at Sunset Mountains, painted in shades of amber and gold that reminded Garrett of the blizzard night when headlights had pierced through white chaos and changed everything. Tori had said yes before he finished asking, laughing and crying simultaneously in the way of people who'd stopped believing in second chances until one materialized against all probability. They planned the wedding for next spring, giving time for Silver Wings chapters across 6 states to make travel arrangements and Sophie to master her dual role as flower girl and ring bearer. Diana had volunteered to officiate her online ordination certificate, legitimate enough for Colorado law and meaningful enough for everyone involved. Sheriff Brennan stopped by weekly, his son Jake working part-time at the lodge as dishwasher and maintenance help while he completed his psychology degree on the GI Bill. The young veteran's PTSD had improved with therapy and medication and the structure of employment that offered purpose without overwhelming pressure. Coleman had been arrested in February, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted extortion, and a dozen other counts that Jennifer's team had helped prosecutors build. Restitution funds had been established, though no amount of money could truly compensate families who'd lost generational businesses to corporate greed disguised as legitimate commerce. Garrett had testified at 3 depositions and 1 grand jury hearing each session, forcing him to relive 18 months of systematic harassment. But the process had also been cathartic, transforming his private struggle into public record that would protect others from similar predation. Jennifer had filed civil suits on behalf of 17 affected businesses, using Garrett's case as the template for arguments that were succeeding beyond anyone's initial expectations. The financial settlement from First Mountain Bank had cleared the remaining debt entirely, the bank choosing to forgive all $6,000 rather than risk being named in lawsuits that could expose their inadequate oversight of Coleman's schemes.